We're continuing our discussion of marginalized voices in the 19th century and the literature produced by those who were marginalized in the United States in the time before the Civil War. Today I want to talk about Native American resistance and the rhetoric that came out of the resistance efforts of Native Americans to be able to continue to hold on to their land and have treaties that had been made with colonial British, French, and American governments fully recognized. By the 19th century, there were a few major issues that were confronting Native Americans at the dawn of this new era of American life. Those issues included outcomes of wars. So there are a few key wars in the late 18th century and 19th century that we'll want to focus on for the purpose of this discussion. The first is the 7 Years' War, what's sometimes called in American history courses, especially at the high school level, the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict between the French and the British. And in North America, it was primarily fought in colonial Britain and Canada, and is known as the French and Indian War, as I said. It pitted the British against the French, and many Native American communities had been allied with the French through trade and other economic factors. And some had allied themselves with the British, but most had allied themselves with the French, which is why the name French and Indian War is usually in use. Britain won that war, which is also to say that the French and many Native Americans lost that war. In 1763, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Paris, and that is what really culminates the war and inaugurates what will be the British Empire, as we'll see over time. Britain really begins to dominate the lands, the colonial lands, that have been taken from indigenous people outside of Europe. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, Britain gained most of France's land possessions and colonies in North America, including Canada. Britain also gained islands in the Caribbean, and the area between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. So if you imagine the land, it's going to cut down sort of out to the edge of where the 13 colonies were, the British North American colonies, out to the Mississippi River, which runs up from New Orleans up into Minnesota and separates, Iowa from Illinois and Missouri from Illinois and Kentucky, Arkansas from Mississippi, Louisiana from Mississippi, and so forth. All of that land from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains, France cedes to Britain. This is, of course, a challenge to many of the Native Americans in these lands, because they had previously had agreements between themselves and the French government that had to do with economic factors, and were they able to have autonomy on their lands and so forth. The second major war that has an important outcome in the lives of Native Americans is the Revolutionary War. During the Revolutionary War, many Native Americans sided with the British over the American colonists, and that was a very political choice on their part. they believed by that point that they had become better established, though they had their own issues and certainly many struggles with the British government and the way that it controlled the lands and thought of the lands and the people who lived on those lands. They thought that they faced a better outcome under the British being successful in the Revolutionary War than if the American colonists were successful in the Revolutionary War. And they again took sides with the British during the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is sometimes referred to as the Second Revolutionary War because in a lot of ways it pits the Americans against the British again. America by this point is a fully formed and independent nation. Tensions arose between the Americans and the British regarding British efforts to try to restrict American trade on the seas. There was friction in the Northwest involving concerns and the British had been seen as sort of deliberately agitating native communities to push back against the American expansion as the American government was attempting to expand westward into the Northwest Territories and also into the Southwest. We're still talking about the land that's to the east of the Mississippi River now, but as the government is starting to expand the nation, the British are sort of encouraging the Native Americans to push back against the American government. The Americans win the War of 1812, and really, once America wins the War of 1812, the idea that the British would pose some sort of existential threat to the new American nation, that really goes away, which is why it's sometimes called the Second Revolutionary War. America really kind of defended itself and came out on the other side, and Britain no longer posed a threat to America at that time. Note that each side that the majority of Native Americans aligned themselves with in each of those conflicts, not all Native American communities, right? It's really important to keep that in mind, that not all, we shouldn't think of the Native American communities as monolithic or sharing the same values or the same ideas. They had just as much debate, cultural debate, political debate, social debate, about what the proper course was in terms of trying to maintain their autonomy or whether they should more strongly ally themselves with the dominant power in the land in order to try to get the best deal and that they could possibly get that was going to protect their community by trading away certain ideas or trading away certain requests that they had in order to try to maintain a level of autonomy. But notice, to my point, as I was saying before I cut myself off, that each of the major wars, each of those three wars that Native Americans allied themselves in, they came out on the losing side of each of them. Having allied with the French and being defeated by the British in the 7 Years' War, having allied themselves with the British and being defeated by the Americans in the Revolutionary War, and then aligning themselves again with the British and losing to the Americans in the War of 1812. Each one of the outcomes of those wars emboldened the opposing side to continue to push its own policy agendas, often at the expense of Native American communities. Another key issue confronting Native Americans in the 19th century involved land appropriation. This includes efforts of states and the federal government to continue expanding land to the west, away from just the American colonies on the coast and expanding westward. Each time this happens, there's a tightening of how much land is going to be available to the Native American populations during this time. There are events that happen during this time where we see efforts on behalf of the British government to intentionally stoke or provoke conflicts between British soldiers and Native American communities, with the idea that prompting such a conflict would lead to a battle between the two, which would have to conclude in some sort of peace negotiation that would then allow for land to be ceded as part of the treaty process. The resolution to the conflict would lead to some sort of agreement to share the land, to split the land, to, in essence, allow the continued westward expansion. A third major issue confronting Native Americans in the 19th century involves then those treaties ultimately not being recognized. So treaties would frequently be made between colonial government and the Native Americans, between the British and the Native Americans, or between the American government and the Native Americans. And then those treaties would either be written in such a way as to be essentially unenforceable, or written in such a way to have the signatories give away more than they intended, right? There would be certain conditions attached to land usage, and then when those conditions were not met, sometimes even conditions that the government knew would not be met, then there would be a demand to cede that land to the government. And in doing so, the treaties themselves were either being enforced in a way that we might consider taking advantage of legal loopholes in the treaties, or treaties themselves might have language that would be simply ignored by a new head of state or by a new Congress. The fourth major issue that confronts Native Americans in the 19th century is called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 came shortly after the election of Andrew Jackson to the presidency. He's elected to the presidency in 1828, and Jackson largely wins election based on a reputation for being someone who fights Native Americans. And one of the things that he sought as following his election is he wanted the ability to relocate Native American tribes and people living to the east of the Mississippi River. He wanted the power to be able to relocate them to the west of the Mississippi River. Of course, most of these Native American tribes wanted to remain on their ancestral homelands. But the Indian Removal Act, which is passed by the Congress and then signed into law by Jackson, allows the relocation, the forcible relocation of Native American communities to the west of the Mississippi River. This is where present-day Oklahoma begins in this time to be conceived of as quote-unquote Indian territory. And those who were forcibly moved from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi were resettled into the area that is now the state of Oklahoma. Many of them were, or they moved to the west of the Mississippi River, sometimes crossing from, let's say, Illinois across the Mississippi into Missouri, or even going westward further beyond that. This is what is going to begin, a lot of the issues that will arise after the Civil War, and will continue to arise once gold is discovered in California. And once the United States decides it would like to build a transcontinental railroad that's going to run from the Pacific Ocean to the East Coast and run through major cities. That's going to require a lot of the territory of the United States to become organized into states, which is going to better protect the railroad during that time. Of course, this is not only going to have large consequences for the Native American communities, but as we'll see and in future discussions, it's going to have major consequences for the tensions that are going to arise within the United States government on whether those Western territories that are in the process of becoming states are going to remain free labor states, or whether they're going to be states where slavery is going to be able to be permitted. The westward expansion of the United States, specifically whether slavery should expand out of the Deep South, is a key factor in what's going to lead to the Civil War. After Andrew Jackson leaves office in 1838, the United States government, the United States military, forcibly expelled the Cherokee Nation out of Georgia to be moved westward. This was a forcible relocation of approximately 15,000 Cherokee people who had refused to leave their lands and were forcibly moved by federal troops westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Around 4,000 people died. That's a little more than a quarter, between a quarter and a third of all those who were on that forcible relocation in the winter died as a result of that. So these are just a selection of the issues that are being faced. And the timeline here really runs from around the 1750s, 1760s to the 1840s, 1850s. So a century within American history that we're talking about in today's lecture. And I say that because many of the selections that we're going to look at cross and span a long period of time. We're going to look at selections of Native American rhetoric from both Volume A and Volume B of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, 10th edition. So you'll want to have those handy as we take a look at those texts. Let's try to move in approximately chronological order here, just to get a sense of what we're talking about. And I want to make sure that we have these ideas here on the board, because I don't want you to get the impression that all of these are happening at the exact same time. As I said, they're following across approximately 100-year period in American history. So these are generations of Native Americans who are engaging in resistance and pushback against the United States government. We talked about when we reviewed the oral literature with the Native American creation narratives, that there was a focus on an oral literary culture within many Native American communities. Less of a focus on writing and more of a focus on oral-based storytelling, oral examples of rhetoric. And by the 18th century, interest in political oratory and Republican, small r, Republican government led European Americans and Americans to become fascinated with the oral culture of Native American communities, particularly within the governing tribes of that time, and the way that the communications and conflict resolution was handled by governing councils and tribes within Native American communities. The archetype, one might even say stereotype, of the quote-unquote eloquent Indian arose during this time. A literary type in which a Native American speaker would have the words said in a speech transcribed, and those words were supposed to embody the principles of rhetoric. when we talk about rhetoric here, we're talking about it in the classical literary sense, not of just speech in general, but an act of highly effective persuasive speech. So we're thinking about rhetoric here as the art of persuasion, or the art of effective communication. And as debates began to arise in like stories related to the Continental Congress and the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of the Constitution and the creation of legislatures throughout the American colonies, and then of course the American government itself, the idea of like the legislator, the individual who stands up and speaks their mind and tries to persuade a group of people to adopt a particular position, becomes associated as well with Native American literature. And so at this time you have a lot of American books, newspapers, textbooks, school books that are reprinting a lot of these speeches. And each of these speeches can be looked at closely for the way that it is using language to try to achieve its ends. I want to start with the excerpts in Volume A with the speech from Pontiac at Detroit. So often these speeches would be witnessed by somebody who would then write down the speech, either in collaboration with the speaker or as an afterthought. So, the speech would be witnessed and then somebody would transcribe the speech, probably from memory, probably making tweaks and other kinds of enhancements. The Norton Anthology helpfully has a term for this. The term is bicultural composites. So the bicultural composite refers to a text that is produced by both Native Americans, a speaker from a Native American community, and somebody from outside that community who is writing it down in English. It might not be written in the original language. We might not think that the actual words spoken are literally word for word what was spoken at that moment. So the effect becomes something that is simultaneously oral and simultaneously literary in a written sense, and existing somewhere between the two. Sometimes this was even fabricated, faked, and something would be sold as having been said by somebody, and it couldn't, it's far off from what was actually said. The editors in the Norton Anthologies say that they've taken, great pains to make sure that they're producing the most authentic version of the speech as possible, but just sometimes all that has survived or what endured over the years through multiple readings have a sense of being bicultural composites, which does not mean fake, but we do just have to consider who all is contributing to the authorship of this speech. The speech by Pontiac that's delivered at Detroit is during the 7 Years War, after the 7 Years War. After the British have defeated the French, and the British commanders in North America had developed a contempt for many Native American communities, and as a result they were instituting policies that were much more draconian than Native Americans had experienced under their allied government with the French. Some of these policies refused to supply food or arms or gunpowder to the native people, as the French had done. They abandoned the French policy of seeing the native people as their allies, and instead they adopted an attitude that they were now British subjects, in the same way that Britain would do in many nations around the world, and treat the indigenous people of those communities as subjects of the British Empire. That's what we have happening here. This speech by Pontiac is said to have been delivered in 1763, so this is after the 7 Years' War, and it's trying to persuade the leaders of other nations to join the Ottawa people, which is the nation that Pontiac belonged to, in an armed resistance against the British. And the way that Pontiac goes about trying to make his case persuasively involves channeling what he says is a story that was told by a prophet. The prophet's name is Nealon, and he's of the Delaware nation. So Pontiac tells this story about this epiphany, this revelation that the prophet has when he goes on a journey. He engages, we're told, in fasting and dreaming and reciting magical incantations. And as a result of this, he has this message that is revealed to him. On page 888 of Volume A of the Norton Anthology, Pontiac says, "So precipitous was this ascent that the Indian thought it hopeless to go further." He's talking about the journey that the prophet is taking. And he looked around in despair. At that moment he saw, seated at some distance above, the figure of a beautiful woman arrayed in white, who arose as he looked upon her and thus accosted him. Quote, "How can you hope, encumbered as you are, to succeed in your design? Go down to the foot of the mountain, throw away your gun, your ammunition, your provisions, and your clothing. Wash yourself in the stream which flows there, and you will then be prepared to stand before the Master of life." When he gets the audience, this is what the Master says to the Great Spirit, says to the prophet. "I am the maker of heaven and earth, the trees, lakes, rivers, and all things else. I am the maker of mankind, and because I love you, you must do my will. The land on which you live, I have made for you, and not for others. Why do you suffer the white men to dwell among you? My children, you have forgotten the customs and traditions of your forefathers. Why do you not clothe yourself in skins, as they did, and use the bows and arrows and the stone-pointed lances, which they used? You have bought guns, knives, kettles, and blankets from the white men, until you can no longer do without them. And what is worse, you have drunk the poison fire water, which turns you into fools. Fling all these things away. Live as your wise forefathers lived before you. And as for those English, these dogs dressed in red, who have come to rob you of your hunting grounds and drive away game, you must lift the hatchet against them. Wipe them from the face of the earth, and then you will win my favor back again, and once more be happy and prosperous. The children of your great father, the King of France, are not like the English. Never forget that they are your brethren. They are very dear to me, for they love the red men and understand the true mode of worshiping me." So let's take just a moment and talk about the rhetorical devices that Pontiac is using in order to try to make the speech as persuasive as possible. Note here, Pontiac is the one who has gone to try to form the collective tribal resistance power to push back against the British government. But he makes the speech to the other nations, the Huron and the Potawatomi nations. He makes the speech to them. He's a member of the Ottawa Nation, and he's using a story of a prophet of the Delaware Nation who has had this revelatory experience and has been able to commune with the Great Spirit, the sort of divine force that encompasses all people. And the heart of the persuasive attempt here is language told by the Great Spirit to the prophet, from the prophet to Pontiac, now from Pontiac to another community. So we have a passing of information across individuals from different tribes to different tribes. There's a collective sense of the narrative that has been built here. One gets the impression, perhaps, if anybody in the Huron and Potawatomi tribes are persuaded by Pontiac's rhetoric, that they would then tell the story of the Great Spirit talking to the Delaware prophet, who talked to Pontiac of the Ottawa people, who talked to the Huron and Potawatomi people, who are now talking to a different group of people. So there's a sense in which the words themselves gain force by being built in this idea of having come from a greater authority that has now been passed down or passed across in order to spread the message. And not all within one group, but instead among multiple groups. The rhetorical effort here is to bring multiple groups of people together to form one group. So a divine kind of rhetoric that speaks of one people says we should be making our decisions collectively as Native Americans and not thinking individually about the way our particular nations are interacting with the British government. The advice given by the Great Spirit is very similar to the advice that's given by the figure of the beautiful woman who gives the advice to the prophet. She tells him, throw away your gun, your ammunition, your provisions, and your clothing. Wash yourself in the stream in order to stand before the master of life. And when he gets the opportunity to do so, the advice is very much the same, right? Throw away your clothing, throw away your guns, throw away your provisions. Get rid of these European elements that you have incorporated into your life and return back to your traditions. Sort of a pre-European colonization traditions, right? There's almost something transcendentalist about this. Let's get back to the simpler ways of life. That's going to get us closer in touch with who we are as individuals. It's going to reveal our own character back to us. It's not necessarily, though, it's important to say, it's not necessarily a full repudiation of Europeans, but it's more of a repudiation of the British. An idea that the Native communities are kind of lost to their way in the way that they've become modernized, and they need to get back to the more traditional roots. But it's also in praise of the allyship, the friendship that was established between the Native people and the French, who are spoken of favorably here, right? The children of your great father, the King of France, are not like the English. So the French people are not like the English. They are friends, they are brethren, right? They are dear to me, for they love the red man. The French had a friendlier, more allied relation with Native nations. and they have a greater sense of understanding the traditions within the culture. So just notice here the idea, the way that the language here is being framed. There's something foolish about the people who have bought into the modern ways, and it's not just because they drink the poison firewater, aka alcohol, that they are foolish, but they're sort of foolish in the sense that they've lost their ways and they need to get back to the way that things were. I also ask you to take a look at the speech from Chief Logan, and that is also in the Norton Anthology on page 890. Now, the text of the speech of Chief Logan is relatively short and comes to us from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. You'll remember we took a look at the excerpt from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia in his discussions of slavery. He has much more positive things to say about Native Americans in that text. And he relates here a text that's sometimes called as Logan's Lament. And this is a text that comes from Logan that explains violent resistance against the British. The British had engaged in trying to spring together a war between a community and the British colonies in Virginia in order to try to ultimately end up with some land appropriation. As part of that, 9 people were killed, including Logan's sister, who was pregnant at the time. The soldiers mutilated her, along with her unborn child, who was mutilated as well. At the treaty signing, Logan refused to attend and instead sent this communication regarding why he would not be in attendance. It was one of the more popular instances of the idea of like great Native American rhetoric, and undoubtedly made more famous by the fact that it was heralded by the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison as an example of exemplary rhetoric. Jefferson even says in the introduction to this, "I challenge the whole orations of Demosthenes and Cicero, and of any more preeminent orator, if Europe has furnished more eminent, to produce a single passage superior to the speech of Logan." So he's saying, I challenge all of Europe, as well as the 2 great orators of ancient Greece, Demosthenes, and ancient Rome, Cicero, did they produce a paragraph that rivals the text that Jefferson produces in the last paragraph here from Logan. Let's take a look at what Logan says. "I appeal to any white man to say, if ever he entered Logan's cabin hungry, and he gave him not meat. If ever he came cold and naked, and he clothed him not. During the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin, an advocate for peace. Such was my love for the whites, that my countrymen pointed as they passed and said, 'Logan is the friend of white men.' I had even thought to have lived with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel Cressup, the last spring in cold blood and unprovoked, murdered all the relations of Logan, not sparing even my women and children. There runs not a drop of blood in the veins of any living creature. There runs not a drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature. This called on me for revenge. I have sought it. I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice at the beams of peace. But do not harbor a thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. who is there to mourn for Logan. Not one. So Logan presents here a contrast between the way that he previously treated the white colonists and the British government and the way that they treated him. That he valued friendship and camaraderie and providing and making sure that anybody who experienced hardship would have been clothed and protected had they arrived at his hut, home, cabin. And yet, he has been treated mercilessly and cruelly at the hands of the colonists and the British. When he says there runs not a drop of blood in the veins of any living creature, not a drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature, he's noting here how his family was destroyed. The living members of his family were destroyed. And so now he is alone as a result of his family. And he's happy to see peace, he says, but he is not. It's not because he is afraid of further violence, or he's not having joy at forestalling additional violence. He is not scared of further violence, and he lost everything. And by losing everything, in many respects, that makes him more committed to the cause of justice and vengeance than he may have been otherwise. It's a short but highly effective piece of oratory, and it draws from the economy of its language, the power that it has, the metaphoric way that it phrases its points, and the sort of fear that it tries to produce inside the audience by saying, you know, your actions have left me with nobody, and therefore I am so much less afraid than you may imagine, which in a way could mean so much more dangerous now than you could have possibly imagined. I ask you too to take a look at the speech from Tecumseh, and much like the speech from Pontiac, where we have somebody trying to put together a collective of individuals to engage in a common cause against a perceived enemy, Tecumseh is doing that as well. Tecumseh came from the Shawnee people, and he was unwaveringly hostile to white Americans who were encroaching on the lands of his people. This was mostly in the Northwest Territory, what would be present-day Ohio and Indiana, as the westward expansion was happening. The Shawnee gave up large tracts of land in the early 1800s as part of the Treaty of Fort Wayne. Tecumseh had been opposed to that treaty, so we have even, divisions inside the community about what the right course of action is in dealing with a peace treaty that's being signed at the end of military campaigns. In 1811, the governor of the Indiana Territory, whose name was William Henry Harrison, defeated the forces of Tecumseh's brother at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is near present-day Lafayette in Indiana. Tecumseh was not present at that defeat, but the defeat was disillusioning and demoralizing for many of the followers of Tecumseh's brother, who was known as the Prophet. Tecumseh fought on the side of the British during the War of 1812. He was killed at a battle in southern Ontario. And again, as I had said, many people had believed that they needed the help of the British in order to gain back control of their lands or to stop American settlers from pushing to the west. We could reflect on, would that have been a long-term, a successful strategy? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it would have eventually led to conflicts between the native people and the British. We can't say for certain what the impact would have been there. But the speech that's included in the Norton Anthology of American Literature is a speech similar to Pontiac's, where Tecumseh has gone to a group of different people, and he is trying to forge an alliance against the expansionist agenda of the Americans. This is likely very much a bicultural composite, crafted not only by the rhetoric of Tecumseh, but then as it's remembered and related by a man named John Dunn Hunter, who had been in captivity of the Osage people to whom Tecumseh's address is delivered. I want to just take a look at the opening paragraphs of Tecumseh's speech and just make a couple comments on the rhetoric of what Tecumseh is doing here. Brothers, we all belong to one family. We are all children of the Great Spirit. We walk in the same path, slake our thirst at the same spring. And now affairs of the greatest concern lead us to smoke the pipe around the same council fire. Brothers, we are friends. We must assist each other to bear our burdens. The blood of many of our fathers and brothers has run like water on the ground to satisfy the avarice of the white man. We ourselves are threatened with a great evil. Nothing will pacify them but the destruction of all the red men. Brothers, when the white men first set foot on our grounds, they were hungry. They had no place on which to spread their blankets or kindle their fires. They were feeble. They could do nothing for themselves. Our fathers commiserated their distress and shared freely with them whatever the Great Spirit had given his red children. They gave them food when hungry, medicine with sick, spread skins for them to sleep on, and gave them grounds that they might hunt and raise corn. Brothers, the white people are like poisonous serpents. When chilled, they are feeble and harmless, but invigorate them with warmth, and they sting their benefactors to death. The white people came among us feeble, and now we have made them strong. They wish to kill us or drive us back as they would wolves and panthers. Brothers, the white men are not friends to the Indians. At first, they only asked for land sufficient for a wigwam. Now nothing will satisfy them but the whole of our hunting grounds and from the rising to the setting sun. Brothers, the white men want more than our hunting grounds. They wish to kill our warriors. They would even kill our old men, women, and little ones. Okay, rhetorically, I think Tecumseh is doing a couple of really effective things here, right? Look at the prevalence of the first person plural, right? There is no I or you in this passage. It is all we, our, and us. A sense of the collective, right? A sense that though they are of different nations, they all face the same threat and will find strength through collective action themselves. In addition to the first person plural rhetoric of we, us, and ours, Tecumseh uses words that indicate a sense of community and oneness, right? He uses words like all and one and same. And when he starts talking about the European colonists and the American government, he uses them. there is a monolithizing element to what Tecumseh is trying to achieve with his rhetoric. He's literally setting up an us and them paradigm. Right? And one might say that us and them, it's a little more complicated than that. Right? We know that there are people inside the United States government who had a lot of sympathy to the Native Americans. We also know there were people within Native American tribes that wanted to ally themselves with the government or sign treaties with the government. But in order to achieve this kind of common sense of a cultural defense, Tecumseh is relying on the idea that we need an us and them dichotomy. Right? Because he's trying to coalesce one group of people on one side. And he wants the option to just be, you're either with me or you're against me, because he hopes that that will pressure a sense of creating a with me allied fighting force. The metaphor that he uses of the poisonous snake is, for my money, absolutely brilliant, and one of my favorite metaphors that we've even had a chance to look at this entire term, right? When chilled, they are feeble and harmless, but invigorate them with warmth, and they sting their benefactors to death. Right? The idea being here that when the European colonists came to North America, they were unprepared for the harsh living conditions that they encountered. And they relied on the generosity, of the benevolence, of the hospitality of the native community when they arrived to protect them. And Tecumseh has pointed out that as a result of this, what has happened is, with the help that they had been given, they've been made strong. And now they are turning to the very people who helped them get settled and are exacting a kind of blind, animalistic, primal, selfish action. Right? A snake doesn't think to itself, I want to hurt this person. It's an instinctual response. Right? And that's the idea here, is that there's an instinctual, these are life or death circumstances that Tecumseh is trying to paint for the people to incur the support necessary in order to do what he can do. He does not gain the kinds of support that's necessary, of course, to achieve what he needs to achieve. And dies in battle, and we saw the British on the losing side of the War of 1812, and therefore numerous Native American tribes suffer and struggle as a result of that. I ask you also to read an excerpt from a biography by William Apess. Sons of the Forest is the name of the book that it comes from. It's the first extensive autobiography published by a Native American in American literature. Apess's grandfather was white. He married the granddaughter of the Wampanoag leader King Philip Metacom, who you might remember from our discussions around Mary Rowlandson and the Puritan era of American society. Apess was a reform leader. He was a strong advocate for the rights of Native Americans, and he made the advocacy for the rights and protections of Native Americans within a critique of white racism. He was an evangelical Methodist minister, an itinerant minister as part of his career, and wrote this autobiography. The selection given to you is from one of his other texts, actually. It's from the experiences of 5 Christian Indians of the Pequot tribe, published in 1833. And it's called An Indian's Looking Glass for the White Man. Looking glass is another word for a mirror. The mirror image here is very important, I think, for the rhetorical strategy that Apess evokes in the text. So it's a critique of racism, right? Apess writes that he believes in a God. He's a Christian. He's a minister. He believes in a God who shows no favor to outward appearances, but will judge righteousness. And thinks that racism then is antithetical to the work of God on earth. I mentioned that the idea of the mirror is a really effective image for Apess to evoke. And that's because I think rhetorically, the really fascinating thing that he does throughout this selection is question. He asks multiple questions of his reader. And often these questions will go on and on and on and on. A single paragraph might have 6, 7, 8 questions, or even more. Sometimes these are rhetorical questions. He knows he's not going to get direct answers to his questions, but the questions themselves are designed to provoke introspection and reflection. He writes on the top of page 130, "Now I will ask, if the Indians are not called the most ingenious people among us, and are they not said to be men of talents? And I would ask, could there be a more efficient way to distress and murder them by inches than the way they have taken? And there is no people in the world but who may be destroyed in the same way. Now if these people are what they are held to be in, our view to be, I would take the liberty to ask why they are not brought forward and pains taken to educate them, to give them all a common education, and those of the brightest and first-class talents put forward and held up to office. Perhaps some unholy, unprincipled men would cry out, the skin was not good enough. But stop, friends, I'm not talking about the skin, but about principles. I would ask if there could not be as good feelings and principles under a red skin as there can be under a white. And let me ask, is it not on the account of a bad principle that we who are red children have had to suffer so much as we have? And let me ask, did not this bad principle proceed from the whites or their forefathers? And I would ask, is it worthwhile to nourish it any longer? If not, then let us have a change. He continues, I know that many say that they are willing, perhaps the majority of the people, that we should enjoy our rights and privileges as they do. If so, I would ask, why are we not protected in our persons and property throughout the Union? Is it not because there reigns in the breast of many who are leaders a most unrighteous, unbecoming, and impure black principle, and as corrupt and unholy as it can be? While these very same unfeeling, self-esteemed characters pretend to take the skin as a pretext to keep us from our unalienable and lawful rights? I would ask if you would like to be disenfranchised from all your rights merely because your skin is white and for no other crime. I'll venture to say these very characters who hold the skin to be such a barrier in the way would be the first to cry out, injustice, awful injustice. Right, so the idea here is, he says, the very same people who use a different skin color as a pretext for denying rights, had that be turned on them, would cry out that it's an injustice to be the victims of being denied rights solely on the basis of skin color. Right? So in asking his rhetorical questions, Apess is often putting the idea in the mind of somebody and asking, I think, for empathy rather than simply making the case, it's wrong to judge people by the color of their skin. He asks instead that his white readers position themselves in the place of Native Americans and wonder, how does that person feel? It's a common rhetorical tactic designed to invoke empathy from the reader. If I can get the reader to understand what it's like to be in my situation, then perhaps I can get the reader to adopt a point of view that seems logical in light of how they would act if they were in my situation. Okay? If I can do that, then I can be successful. And the mirror image here is designed to reflect these ideas back in order for the reader to consider how the reader would feel about that. And so the questions don't demand an immediate answer, right? Not in the way that a question like, what's 3 plus 4 equal, demands an answer of 7. But the questions are designed to prompt people to put themselves in the position of others. And through that empathy, perhaps realize the way that they've been acting is incorrect, or to at least be alerted and mobilized to the fact that the people who are in positions of power are making decisions on that basis. And perhaps, therefore, those people should not be in positions of power. The last text that I had asked you to look at as part of this collection of Native American resistance to the encroachment and expansion of the United States government in the 19th century is called a memorial of the Cherokee Council. These memorials are actually better thought of as maybe editorials. They are resolutions that are adopted by a council of leaders within the nation and then sent forward to sort of say, this is the collective will of the people. The Cherokee Council sends this memorial to the Senate and the House of Representatives, aka Congress, as Congress is in the process of debating or considering passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The intent here is very apparent to the Cherokee people, and they're seeking to prevent the passage of the bill, and they're expressing and arguing what they are concerned with. Now, some of the rhetoric here, much like Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, is designed to mirror the Declaration of Independence. There's not a direct overlap of passages like we could have done with Jefferson and Stanton. But even in the opening paragraph here of the Memorial of the Cherokee Council, think about the sound of this and how it has sort of a passing similarity or familiarity with the Declaration of Independence. They write, "We, the representatives of the people of the Cherokee Nation, in general council convened, compelled by a sense of duty we owe to ourselves and nation, and confiding in the justice of your honorable bodies, address and make known to you the grievances which disturb the quiet repose and harmony of our citizens, and the dangers by which we are surrounded. Extraordinary as this course may appear to you, the circumstances that have imposed upon us this duty we deem sufficient to justify the measure. And our safety as individuals and as a nation require that we should be heard by the immediate representatives of the people of the United States, whose humanity and magnanimity, by permission and will of heaven, may yet preserve us from ruin and extinction." Part of the argument put forward in this resolution by the Cherokee Council is that the efforts to remove the Cherokee people from the lands that they occupied in northwestern Georgia is that there were previous treaties in place that had been made between the United States government, or leaders of the United States government, and the Cherokee Nation. Treaties that now are being ignored in the development and subsequent passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. There is a very self-conscious effort here to establish a sense of governance, right? The argument here is not just that this is unfair, that it is immoral, that it is unethical, that it is an affront to human rights, but instead it's an argument that, look, there was a deal that was in place, and we're asking that this deal be respected by both sides that were put together in the development of that deal. And the language here is highly attentive to legal writing and legal language. On page 295, they write, "Our sovereignty and right of enforcing legal enactments extend no further than our territorial limits, and that of Georgia is and has always terminated at her limits." The Constitution of the United States, Article 6, contains these words, quote, "All treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the laws or constitution of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. The sacredness of treaties made under the authority of the United States is paramount and supreme," they write, "stronger than the laws and constitution of any state. The jurisdiction then of our nation over its soil is settled by the laws, treaties, and constitution of the United States, and has been exercised from time out of memory. As a distinct nation, notwithstanding any unpleasant feelings it might have created to a neighboring state, we had a right to improve our government, suitable to the moral, civil, and intellectual advancement of our people. And had we anticipated any notice of it, it was the voice of encouragement by an approving world." So they say that they've taken great efforts to establish a government within their own nation, that has been endorsed and approved by voices in the outside world, that they have done everything right, and now they are asking for the law to be respected as part of the defense against the actions that are coming. They write on page 296, "Many of our people are experiencing all the evils of personal insult, and in some instances expulsion from their homes and loss of property from the unrestrained intruders let loose upon us, and the encouragement they are allowed to enjoy under the last order to the agent for this nation, which amounts to a suspension of the force of treaties and the wholesome operation of the intercourse laws of the United States. If the state of Georgia has a claim to any portion of our lands, it is entitled by law and justice to them. Let her seek through a legal channel to establish it. We do hope that the United States will not suffer her to take possession of them forcibly and investigate her claim afterwards." So they are open to the political process. They are open to the judicial process, but they're not. What they want to forestall here is the forcible removal of people from their lands, and then after doing so, investigate whether they had the right to do so. As I said, the language here is self-consciously legal, self-consciously designed to appeal to a sense of civil governance, to show a sense of equal standing before the law, but yet ultimately the effort is not successful. The Indian Removal Act passes, and within a decade, the last remaining members of the Cherokee Nation are forcibly expelled by the military and moved westward to where present-day Oklahoma is. This is really just a scratch of the selections of voices from Native America. And you can see elsewhere in the anthology voices from white writers who are concerned about the treatment of Native Americans under the federal government. There's a letter from Ralph Waldo Emerson, for instance, on this topic. But what I wanted to do instead was, just as we tried to focus on the voices of women during the early part of the 19th century, and as we will focus soon on the voices of those who experienced slavery, I wanted to give time in our course to the expression of the voices of the Native Americans who found themselves struggling against an expanding American nation. And the constant threats that they were under to hold on to their autonomy, hold on to their lands, and hold on to their way of life. They were ultimately not successful in that, and they were relocated west of the Mississippi River. If you have an opportunity to take a course like American Lit 2 here at the college, hopefully you'll have an opportunity to explore how the later part of the 19th century, how the actions during that time affected the Native Americans who were living in the West, as the westward expansion of the government continued to do so in the creation of tribal reservation lands and other issues continue to affect the Native people at this time. In our next lectures, we're going to turn to the genre of the slave narrative and consider the voices of enslaved people during the time before the Civil War. We'll conclude that discussion with a look at one of the absolute masterpieces of American literature, Frederick Douglass's Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass.